In the summer of 1914, Europe blundered into one of the greatest cataclysms in the history of the world. It began a European civil war that would claim more than 16 million lives, with another 20 million people wounded. By the time it was all over, World War I had rearranged the architecture of global power more quickly, completely, and decisively than any other event of the last 1,000 years. At its root, World War I reflected what happens when a system designed for balance goes out of balance, because formerly strong powers have become weak, and formerly weak powers have become strong. Specifically, in the 1800s, Europe had been managed by the Concert of Europe, an arrangement of the great powers that had been put in place in 1815 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But by the end of the 1800s, things had changed dramatically. Germany was rising in power, while England's relative power was declining. If England didn't confront Germany's rise, it would eventually be eclipsed as the world's greatest power. That is the essential context that underlay World War I. So, both Germany and England assembled alliances for the Continental War that seemed destined to come. Germany recruited Austria-Hungary and Italy to create the Triple Alliance. England buried its rivalries with its historic enemies, France and Russia, to create the Triple Entente. The rosters would change somewhat, but that was the essential configuration that led Europe into conflict in the summer of 1914. The war started in an almost freakish way. In June 1914, the heir apparent to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in the city of Sarajevo. Germany believed that Russia's ally, Serbia, was behind the assassination. So it pushed its ally, Austria-Hungary, to attack Serbia. But Russia came to Serbia's defense. This led Germany to declare war on Russia and Russia's ally, France. But then England came to the aid of France by declaring war on Germany. Events had fallen like dominoes. Within a month of the Archduke's assassination, the entire continent was at war. Germany faced a major strategic challenge. It was surrounded by enemies, France to the west and Russia to the east. Its plan was to move quickly against France and put it out of the war, and then turn east to deal with Russia. This was the Schlieffen Plan. As with many war plans, it failed once the fighting ensued. Within a month of the start of the war, the German offensive in France was stopped. So, 35 miles outside of Paris, German forces dug trenches as defensive fortifications. The French and the British did the same. Both sides would stay in their trenches for the duration, giving the war one of its defining characteristics: trench warfare. Another defining characteristic of the war were the new technologies that were brought to the battlefield: tanks, airplanes, flamethrowers, mustard gas, expanded use of machine guns, and more. This combination of battlefield stalemate due to trench warfare and new technologies for the mechanization of killing produced yet a third defining characteristic of the war: massive, unstoppable slaughter. The Battle of Verdun in France in 1916 produced 970,000 casualties, the most of any single battle in the history of the world up to that time. But later in the same year at the Somme River, casualties surpassed 1.2 million. The battlefield of World War I became a byword for unstoppable, industrialized massacre. The bulk of the fighting occurred on the Western Front, in France and Belgium. But the Germans also fought the Russians in the east, inflicting great damage to the Russian government. In March 1917, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated, or quit. Into the vacuum swept a handful of communists led by Vladimir Lenin. In October 1917, they took over the Russian state in the Russian Revolution. The communists would rule Russia until the collapse of the Soviet Union until 1991. Another theater of conflict was the Middle East. England wanted to attack Germany from the rear, forcing it to divert forces from the Western Front. So, it encouraged Arabs to revolt against the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was allied with Germany. This gambit failed, but when the war was over, England and France carved up the defeated Ottoman Empire. The modern map of the Middle East, including Palestine, or what is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey, was laid down in the settlement of World War I. By 1917, with Russia out of the war, the real possibility loomed that Germany might win. So, in April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Within a year, there were more than 1 million U.S. forces in Europe. The fresh soldiers quickly overwhelmed the by then exhausted German troops. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, all was quiet on the Western Front. The greatest war in the history of the world, at least up to that time, was over. The Treaty of Versailles was imposed on Germany to settle the war. It carved up Germany, giving important regions to surrounding countries. It blamed Germany for all of the damages inflicted during the war. It gave away German colonies in Asia and imposed penalties called reparations that made it all but certain that Germany could never recover. And in fact, soon after the war, Germany fell into economic turmoil. Out of the ashes of that turmoil rose a demagogue, Adolf Hitler. Hitler promised the German people he would repudiate the Treaty of Versailles and reverse the humiliation the German people felt it had inflicted on them. Within only 20 years of the end of the First World War, Hitler would drag the world back again into a second one. It is instructive to note that although the fighting had stopped, the Treaty of Versailles did not, in fact, settle the war. World War I was Germany versus Russia, France, England, and the United States. World War II was Germany versus Russia, France, England, and the United States. World War I was a European civil war that pulled the rest of the world in with it. It brought to bear an unending supply of the most advanced weapons of a modern technological civilization for the explicit purpose of industrializing human slaughter. World War I caused the destruction of 4 great empires, more than had ever expired in a single conflict. 11 new nations were created in its aftermath, more than had ever been born from any single event. Those nations included the nations of the modern Middle East. Communism emerged from the war as a state-based system. It would become one side of the conflict that would ensnare the entire world for the better part of the second half of the 20th century, that is, the Cold War. World War I was the event where the center of global power shifted from Europe, where it had resided for centuries, to the United States, where it still lives today. And because of its flawed settlement, the war to end all wars led directly, just 20 years later, to the start of World War II. Because of its novelty, the enormity, its scope, and its enduring impact on the entire planet, World War I is considered by many historians as the most significant event of the last 1,000 years.